Hey there, welcome back for our fourth and final segment. We're going to be talking about Riot Girl and the presence of female voices within the punk and grunge genre. Riot Girl has had a long-standing sort of history and lineage that goes beyond just the initial contributing group and groups thereafter. But there's a really great, informative, not too long documentary that goes through a number of key players and their relationships with other of their male counterparts in other genres and how they influenced the grunge scene. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pull up our documentary on Riot Girl, and then we'll dissect a little bit of it afterwards. So, here we go.
Rock was one of the most important social movements of the 21st century. Punk artists pushed radical social agendas and changed music, film, fashion, and really all aspects of culture. However, as it grew in influence, punk rock became fractured and toxic in many ways. And one of the groups that the movement was most toxic towards was women, who would be assaulted at shows and not taken seriously as artists. Male punks became household names, while females faded into the underground. And so, in the early 1990s, a group of women came up with a vision that would change punk rock and musical history forever. Riot Girl. Let's take a closer look. When women's frustrations with the punk scene began to spill out in the early 1990s, it didn't actually start as music. Many women felt that they had no voice within the scene, so they created a space where they could speak freely: fanzines. Zines had been adopted by the British punk scene in the 1970s as a do-it-yourself way of perpetuating punk culture and sticking it to the establishment. However, some of these early fanzines set the stage for the sexism that would dominate punk rock over the next 2 decades. As far back as 1976, the London punk zine Sniff and Glue wrote, "Punks are not girls." So it was perhaps fitting that women like Toby Vale started to use zines to respond to that very same sexism. Check out this passage she wrote in Jigsaw, a zine of her own publishing. "I feel completely left out of the realm of everything that is so important to me. And I know this is partly because punk rock is for and by boys." And Vale wasn't the only woman that felt like this about the punk scene. Kathleen Hanna had similar feelings when she and Vale formed their own zine together called Bikini Kill. Around that time, 2 women named Alison Wolfe and Molly Newman were also collaborating on Girl Germs, a seminal feminist zine. With zines having brought them together, these women decided that if they really wanted to get a message to the punk community, the best way to do it was through punk's main vehicle: music. In October 1990, Vale and Hanna teamed up with Billy Karen and Kathy Wilcox to form Bikini Kill, named after their zine. Then, in February 91, Aaron Smith joined Wolfe and Newman, and together they became Bratmobile. These bands were 2 of the driving forces behind Riot Girl. You can hear this drive and determination in their music. Just listen to Rebel Girl, arguably Bikini Kill's most famous song, and one that became an anthem of sorts for the movement. Bratmobile used satire to jab at the punk scene and the expectations of women in society. In their early days, Bikini Kill would encourage women at their shows, which put off men in the punk scene. They regularly got heckled on stage, and sometimes men would even try to physically assault Hanna, who would fearlessly go into the crowd to personally see hecklers out of their shows. In the second issue of Bikini Kill, the band set out a manifesto for their movement and gave it its name. Riot Girl was officially born.
Okay, and I'm going to pause it there. That manifesto is part of your reading. It's 1 page. It's a really interesting document, though, and really calls to some of the characteristic and aesthetic qualities of the movement as a whole. So um, please be sure to look at that one in particular, because it goes in. You can read it obviously in its entirety.
The name came from a number of sources. Jen Smith used the words girl riot in a letter to Allison Wolfe when she was talking about the Mount Pleasant race riots. She was saying that women needed to have a similar riot. The girl part of the title was just as pointed. It came from the fact that these women remembered feeling most empowered as children, as girls, before they were forced to face the demands of society and the male gaze. Bikini Kill and Bratmobile were far from the only Riot Girl bands too. Just listen to Huggy Bear, who had an infamous performance on Terry Christian's youth show, The Word.
Post-tension realization. This is happening without your permission. The arrival of a new renegade girl band.
L7 were also a political punk band that existed before Riot Girl and became associated with the scene for a period.
This guy was drunk, stupid, and he must have weighed a ton. Said, get out of here, girlie, I'm just trying to have some fun. So you wanna have some fun? Well, break out the big guns. Let's separate. Don't cross my lines.
It's important to note the aesthetic of Riot Girl too. While it draws from punk rock, it's unabashedly female. Riot Girl bands wore their hair in ponytails and performed in makeup and dresses. Kathleen Hanna even sung in a Valley Girl accent frequently. The Riot Girl Manifesto laid out some of the key aspects of their movement. They wanted to create a place for women to hear and see each other, and they wanted to do it without assimilating to male standards. Furthermore, they wanted to revive and rejuvenate punk rock's DIY culture, which they felt had grown stale in the face of commercialism. That same commercialist world often misconstrued Riot Girl, creating controversy around the spectacle of their performance rather than focusing on the substance behind it. However, press attention was never really the goal of Riot Girl. The movement wasn't concerned with fame and success, but rather with effecting real change on a ground level, and they did just that. The thriving zine community provided resources for queer youth as well as women who had been sexually abused or who were struggling with mental illness. It became common for people to hand out pamphlets at shows and foster a community of people respecting and loving women. It also provided a new space for feminist thought, moving it from the high halls of academia onto the dirty stage of punk rock. In a lot of ways, the sharing of resources, experience, and art between women was a precursor to what we've seen more and more recently with the internet. Riot Girl also had a lasting impact on music. Sleater-Kinney formed in Washington towards the end of the movement and went on to become massive in the American indie rock scene. After Riot Girl, women discussing female empowerment was more accepted in the mainstream too, with acts like Fiona Apple and Alanis Morissette having huge success throughout the rest of the 90s. The original Riot Girl movement had mostly burned out by the mid-90s, but many of its tenets continued. Kathleen Hanna went on to create Le Tigre, another feminist band that had success throughout the late 90s and 2000s. And even today, bands like Pussy Riot and White Lung draw from the Riot Girl movement, and some of them even identify as Riot Girl themselves. So the impacts of Riot Girl still last to this day. Riot Girl was the last stand of the true punk ethos. It was smart, badass, and free, and it was unabashedly feminine. And it affected real change in the music culture. While Riot Girl helped make big strides, we still have a long way to go when it comes to getting female voices into the music world. And that's why I want to give a big shout out to the Women's Audio Mission.
And you can definitely clue into the conclusion of that video, but the end point is indeed true. The music in general is still a very male-dominated art form. It's promising to see a counter movement to punk and grunge that were really excluded women as a, and Riot Girl being a again, not a band, but a movement, an umbrella for which a bunch of other bands sort of huddled under for representation. And, you know, I want to make sure to play us a full example of, a Riot Grrrl song. I'm going to pick something by Bikini Kill that wasn't covered in the video. However, it's important to know that, especially as the genre continues and kind of comes back more in line with rock, we do have the presence of some more female voices, but not in the concentration like we did with Riot Grrrl specifically. And really cool and interesting relationships that formed within this group and circle of musicians. And as the end of part 3 notes, Smells Like Teen Spirit was, created in part because Bikini Kill and Nirvana were rubbing elbows with one another. And so while there was some friendliness within the community, it's important to know that like cross-pollination and stuff between genres is particularly infectious and important. And we've seen this trend over and over and over again. Let me pull up our last listening example for today's lecture, which is going to be Bikini Kill.
God, I'm so sure. What?
So same characteristics that we heard in a lot of the early grunge scene in the 80s, early 80s, mid 80s, that high level of distortion, screaming and yelling in the vocal parts, lots of thrashing when it comes to the on stage presence, this unrefined kind of look and feel to it. And in the case of Riot Grrrl, when you can hear the lyrics, tend to be expressly, pro female. about women having power and being, wielding that power in a revolutionary and rebellious way. So that's Bikini Kill Live in '93. Again, if you liked the mission of that group and were interested in their manifesto, you should check out other groups that are underneath that label, most certainly. I'm going to bring up my lecture notes one last time as a way of closing us out for today. We didn't get to a couple of topics. Alice in Chains, I kind of feel like we covered that discussion with the extension of Pearl Jam, this idea of, a group that starts to be kind of more suspiciously aligned with rock than it is with grunge or punk. Well, certainly not even punk, because usually these groups, as we've heard certainly with Pearl Jam, even flow kind of has a slower tempo and pace to it. We also didn't get to Soul Asylum, a proto-grunge group that predates obviously the grunge movement. However, the rest of this we did cover, and I hope this has given you an idea as to what was taking place musically in alternative music culture in the Pacific Northwest, specifically Seattle. Nirvana being an exemplary group within this genre that really pushed it forward and put it on the map with songs like It Smells Like Teen Spirit. But, again, to kind of wrap this around with other art forms coinciding with these, this is also the time in which hip hop was on the rise in the East Coast and in California. So interesting that we have these two competing styles, and even that Nirvana bumps Michael Jackson from sort of the top of the list, which is almost unheard of for the king of pop. So like I said, hope this gives you some interesting insight into grunge where you might not have had it before. When I see you for our next lecture, it will be our last meeting together. We're going to discuss one more northbound topic, and that is we're going to focus our attentions and energies on Chicago, and specifically the jazz scene. We haven't spoken a whole lot about jazz at all this term, and mostly because there are whole classes at Brooklyn College that are dedicated to just jazz alone, but it was also really an important genre in the 1930s or 20s, 30s, and 40s, and certainly continued its reach into the remainder of the century. And what was happening in Chicago before the mid part of the century is particularly interesting to look at. So I will see you for our last lecture tomorrow. Bye for now.